Hello, hello, hello. This is Dr. J. Dr. J's Movie Imaginarium, episode number 3. Today we're going to talk about Wizard of Oz, a movie from 1939, the greatest year of classic Hollywood cinema. But before we do, we have a guest speaker here on the podcast. This is Dr. Dan. Dr. Dan is a professor of history here at Fort Hays State University and is also interested in movies and culture, entertainment, the ways in which they influence and affect politics, but as drivers of history as well. Hello, Dr. Dan.
Hello, how are you doing?
Good. How are you doing, sir?
Really great.
Good. You want to talk a little bit about your research?
I explore economics and culture, U.S., African diaspora, 1960s, 1980s.
Very nice. He's got a new book coming out from UNC Press about neoliberalism, economics, and cultural forms that these iterations may take. Let's launch into it, shall we, Dr. Dan?
Let's go.
Talk a little bit about Wizard of Oz. When was the first time you've seen this movie?
Sometime in the 80s.
Okay.
Sort of the neighborhood ritual.
Okay.
Watching it whenever it'd come on broadcast television.
Okay. And what age would you be at about this time?
About 10, 11.
10, 11. Pretty late in the game, I think, for Wizard of Oz, right? I remember watching this. I don't know when the first time I saw this movie was. It's probably before the age of 5. But I do remember one of my first movie memories was my sister and I, as the Wicked Witch of the West would spin out and come up into Munchkin Land with the red smoke and everything. My older sister and I, in rapt anticipation, the moment the Wicked Witch of the West would come out, we would scurry behind the furniture and we would hide behind the couch or a chair or something like that, just like a munchkin in Munchkin Land. And that was one of my first movie memory. Not the very first movie memory. Actually, my very first movie memory is Alfred Hitchcock's The Birds, the moment in which Mitch's mother goes to check on the neighbor, and she walks in the bedroom, and the neighbor is all bloodied up, and his eyes have been gouged out by birds.
Excellent.
I was about 4.5, and that's the very first memory of a movie that I have. Easy to remember, hard to forget from a little kid's perspective, that scene. I will probably do The Birds, actually, in a later episode, so I'll touch upon that again. Well, Wizard of Oz, this great and wonderful film, a film that is, as I mentioned, of 1939, the greatest year in classic cinema. Wizard of Oz, Gone with the Wind, Ninotchka, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, Stagecoach, a terrific film called The Women. In fact, even the greatest film, in my opinion, for French cinema, The Rules of the Game, directed by Jean Renoir, one of the great French films. 1939 was just the height of the golden era of classic Hollywood cinema. In 1939, the average American was buying around 40 movie tickets a year. The average American. Think about how many movie tickets you buy a year. Dr. Dan, how many movie tickets on average do you buy a year?
I'd say about 2.
About 2 or so. That's right in with the national average. I think the national average last year was 2.8 movie tickets a year. In 1939, it was 40. Think about that. Think about that. Millions of Americans were going to the movies 2, 3, 4 times a week. And there were no multiplexes back then. Many folks, obviously there were downtown movie theaters, the movie palaces downtown, and they would have more diverse fare of film. But a lot of American moviegoers in the classic era were going to neighborhood movie theaters. And neighborhood movie theaters were single screen, and movies would often stay in a neighborhood theater for a week or 2 or even 3 weeks. And in that kind of environment, many Americans, millions of Americans, were going to see the same movie again and again. They'd go see Stella Dallas with Barbara Stanwyck from 1937. They'd see that movie 2, 3, 4 times before it left the neighborhood movie theater. I think this certainly helps the complexity of classic Hollywood narrative in a sense that this has often been said for folks that are not very familiar with 1930s, 1940s Hollywood film, the complexity of the dialogue, for example, the rich innuendo, the subtextual sort of expression of the dialogue. It's quick-witted, it's fast-paced, it's filled with at least 3 different layers of meaning. And so it often, it was a movie that you'd want to go see again 2 or 3 or 4 times in order to catch some of that complexity. These movies had a remarkable depth to them, which I think certainly lasts over the first viewing, the second viewing, the third viewing. There's always something new to explore with a classic Hollywood film, and I think to a certain extent, I'm a bit of a traditionalist in this regard. I think contemporary film has lost the art of storytelling, lost the art of narrative and dialogue. contemporary film is too wedded to the spectacle of visuality and rapid-fire editing. I think a great example I always use in my classes is that film Inception with Leonardo DiCaprio, directed by Christopher Nolan. Inception is just a rapid machine gun fire of images with super fast editing, and it's just this sort of visual explosion. But when you take a step back and you think about the story itself, there's not much to the story at all. In fact, it tries to be complicated, a dream within a dream within a dream within a dream. It's just nesting, there's nothing there. There's no real complexity to the narrative. And I think it's a good example of where contemporary film has gone. What do you think, Dr. Dan? Contemporary film lost the art of storytelling, or am I being a little too harsh?
I'd say you have some points, but I think maybe one thing to look at is the moment World War II comes in and that explosion of film noir. And I think that builds on what you were saying with, the complexity of dialogue, a war interruption, and then that explosion of film noir after, which sets a new standard for film, which to me, film noir kind of creates that next height. And then perhaps from there is the slide.
Yeah. An excellent point. I mean, noir as a genre, one of the great genres of classic Hollywood, and you correctly point out, it's a post-war genre. It really you can find some sort of pre-noir-esque films during the wartime and even the 1930s, but it really explodes as a veritable genre after World War II, and there's a reason for that. A lot of people coming home from the war wanted more serious movie fare. The public, the culture had changed, and they were looking for movies that were more impactful. But as I've also said, the noir genre would have never had happened had there not been the production code. And this is an interesting facet of the production code. This is a self-regulatory censorship system that the Hollywood film industry was to regulate itself through essentially its trade association, the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America, and a particular office they set up, the Production Code Administration, which was based in Hollywood and headed by Joe Breen. That office took their censorship and moral regulation of the films very seriously. But what it did, it didn't so much inhibit. I think this is the sort of surface level impression of what we have with the production code, is that it was a censorship regime that inhibited and kept movies from realizing a fuller expression of itself. And movies were limited, and movies were sort of staid and elementary and maybe too morally pure or clean. Not at all. In fact, what the production code did was require subtextual innuendo. It required movies to play footsie underneath the table. It required a film content that was actually much more sophisticated, and noir is one of the best examples of that. As I've always said about noir, it's sort of the fear of sex and the desire for murder. That's the weird cut of noir. But usually it's the desire for sex and it's the fear of murder. Yeah. But in noir, it's sort of switched around, and symbolically centered to that is the femme fatale.
Yeah, and I think you can see that in the 70s, right? That
with the
70s
neo-noir
moment with neo-noir and sort of that Taxi Driver, that 70s realism, which I think sets the stage for arguably that return of the Wizard of Oz, right? And sort of 80s kids growing up, watching it on television. Obviously, there's something there that drew children to it. And so it's interesting that it comes out of the 70s at the point of, the 60s generation of directors creating narrative-driven films, but it's also the moment of Star Wars, which, I hate to say it, but arguably begins to destroy, Jaws, Close Encounters, Star Wars, that blockbuster, perhaps the undermining of a narrative-driven type film.
Good points. I don't think that's a bad thing to say at all. Don't hate to say it, Dr. Dan. I like that. I'm not a big fan of the Star Wars franchise anyway. We haven't had that conversation yet, but eventually we'll get there.
Yes.
Return to Oz. What a weird movie for the 1980s. A very strange film, I think, in a lot of ways.
I don't think I ever saw it.
Hadn't seen that one?
No.
I haven't seen. I'm not too familiar with it. I've only been introduced to it essentially because of my daughter, who's 5. She started watching Return to Oz. It's pretty dark and sort of it's labyrinthine-esque, like Labyrinth, the film with David Bowie, and it has some really interesting dark touches to it. But the original Wizard of Oz, at least in terms of film, is not the 1939 classic version. It's a silent version. Wizard of Oz from 1913. Wizard of Oz had been, sort of movie fare almost from the very beginning of its publication, and is a story that is filled with sort of archetypes of the kind of narratives that have been filtered and processed throughout human history from even prehistorical human experience. And I think it's a right movie to discuss and talk about in a theoretical way. So it's a movie of that great year, 1939. It is, of course, in some ways a children's movie, but it is also a movie that had a wide appreciation from all ages, a movie that did phenomenally well. A movie from Hollywood's biggest studio at the time, MGM, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, which really ascends to the heights of the film industry. This movie, I think, is, as I mentioned before, the archetypes are so important, and I want to talk about, and specifically about the kinds of identities that are presented in this journey. And I think it's safe to say that Wizard of Oz is a journey, even more so than most film. One might make the argument that all movies are a journey to some degree or another, but Wizard of Oz is truly a journey, almost a road film, right? In this way. But before we get to those main characters, let me just come up with a few central points. I think that the experience of watching Wizard of Oz as a spectator is one in which Dorothy, obviously the protagonist of the film, but we see ourselves through Dorothy so much. We are all Dorothy. We all begin in this place of which, first and foremost, not even a conception of home, right? Because I think the conception of home is sort of confused right away. Dorothy wants to leave her home and often doesn't talk about it as a place to return home only until later, only until she's encountered with Professor Marvel, right? And Professor Marvel sort of digs into her with basically making her feel bad that she's leaving Aunt Em and Uncle Henry. But that's the beginning of her realizing the importance of home. That comes a little bit later in the film. At least at first, we are Dorothy. We're restless. We want to experience the world. We want to move beyond our sepia-tinted sort of small localities. This reminds me of one of my all-time favorite poems, a poem by a Greek poet named C.P. Cavafy called The City. And it's a rather sad poem, but essentially the main point of the poem is that we're all born in some small corner of the world, all of us. It doesn't matter if you're born in Fiji or Midtown Manhattan or a town of 60 people in northwest Kansas. We're all born in some small corner of the world. And we're sort of trapped. We're born into cages of never being able to experience as much as we really truly want to. And I think this is something we all share. This is one of the ways in which I see this poem as optimistic, is because it really brings all of humanity together. We all share this. We're all born in some small corner of the world. And I think that's the place where Wizard of Oz begins, that we're all Dorothy, and we all have this kind of restlessness of, am I living the purposeful life? What does it mean to live a life filled with purpose? What does it mean to have a meaningful life? Right? And these questions, I think, are right at the center of this film. And as we eventually go into the land of Oz, and Dorothy experiences the colorful world, we're encountered with a series of characters: the Scarecrow, the Tin Man, the Cowardly Lion. And these characters all represent facets of fear and desire in all of us. We are all Dorothy, and we all have sort of shards or fragments of the Scarecrow, of the Tin Man, and of the Cowardly Lion. And those fragments are really foundationally this sort of twin relationship between fear and desire. I've always thought fear and desire were like two sides of the same coin. That if you scratch deep enough into a fear that you have, think of a particular fear that you might have, excavate it deeply, and the deeper you excavate it, you're going to find some kind of desire in there somewhere. Fear and desire, two sides of the same coin, right? Is your fear really about disappointing others, being a disappointment? Well, the underside to this if you dig deep enough, I think there's a desire for greatness, right? There's a desire to achieve in that fear of disappointing others. So you have a fear of monsters, right? Monsters in the forest, monsters in the closet. I think there's some desire here to break free from the chains of normalcy that bind us, right? The cages of normalcy itself. And we're going to talk more about that when we get to horror film. This is an insight brought out by Robin Wood, a great film theorist, that we cheer on the monsters of the horror film. Get 'em, because the monster is smashing the oppression of the norms that surround us, right? The ways in which a normal, staid, and stable life is in itself a kind of oppression. And so we cheer for the monster to destroy all of those things. Maybe your fear is a fear of ghosts, right? Of the ghoulish ghosts in the dark halls. I think there's a desire there, if you dig deep enough, for social connection, for human touch, right? Something that the seemingly intangible ghost represents the other side of. Perhaps you have a fear of being alone, right? Being alone in the universe. I think there's a desire here to manifest a known and grounded identity, right? The fear of being alone is really, in some ways, another way of saying a desire to have a clear, tangible, understood, grounded, and rooted identity of some kind. Who am I, right? And I think we all sort of struggle with who am I at certain points in our lives, because life is a journey, just like Wizard of Oz. And indeed, I think Dorothy's journey is one of self-awareness, of coming to terms with who she is and discovering who she is for the first time. Dorothy is also just a bundle of dichotomy, if you think about it. She has this intense desire to leave sepia-toned Kansas, but then just as quickly an intense desire to return home. So there's sort of this schizophrenia with Dorothy. She's kind of bundling around, at least in the beginning part of the film, with this intensity, this passion, and this emotion. Must leave, must leave. And then almost as quickly turns on a dime and says, must return, must return. This brings up an interesting point that I've always loved from the great filmmaker John Waters. You're familiar with John Waters?
Oh, I love John Waters.
He said, I love his comment about Wizard of Oz, that Wizard of Oz, he never understood why Dorothy would ever want to leave. I mean, think of the color and the fashion and the awesome things going on in the land of Oz. Why would Dorothy ever want to return to,
Well, there's an irony, too, because the Wizard of Oz does use spectacle within the narrative. So we might even have sort of a theme moving through some of these discussions where at what point does the narrative get sacrificed by spectacle, and when does spectacle help elevate the narrative? I was going to say, too, was it L. Frank Baum's 1900, right, from the book from which the movie takes place? That comes out in 1900, which I believe was based off that populist movement.
Yes.
The Yellow Brick Road, the silver and gold debates.
Yeah.
But it's interesting that 1900 is the moment that the U.S. engages. Like 1898 is the Spanish-American War. And so Americans are sort of suspect about going out in the world and participating in sort of a global project the way that Teddy Roosevelt wants. And then 1939, the beginning of World War II, you have this movie coming out. So it is very much a question about American identity, the heartland, and some of these questions about fear and sort of not knowing what the future is going to hold.
Great insights. I really like that. It sort of rings true in the sense that the United States is sepia-toned Kansas, right? In a symbolic way, and to engage the outer world and to see the outer world and all of its unknowns, the land of munchkins, what's that? Flying monkeys, holy cow, right? There's all this otherness. There's all of these things that are very different from what the normal American experience might have been, and sort of inaugurating America into its imperial moment with the Spanish-American War and the possessions of Cuba and the Philippines. And culminating in this classic Hollywood text, 1939, the year of the invasion of Poland by Nazi Germany. I think there's some remarkable resonances there in this sort of like international relations perspective, right?
Yeah, I'd like to see when did it, was it always showing on network television? Like at what point did it start becoming this every year type of ritual? Because that was sort of this, can't remember what month it was, but everyone on the block knew it was coming up, and either you'd watch it on your own or you'd gather and watch it together. So it's interesting that in the 80s it's still this thing, and that's really the dawn of sort of our current globalization, is that late 70s, early 80s moment.
Yeah, I don't know either. We should dig into some of the history of that. I suspect it's probably pretty early on. I know that a lot of the classic era films started to be shown late at night on network.
Okay.
Network started filling in nighttime slots, and the early part of television, the networks just turned off after around 10 or 11 or midnight. But in the late 1950s and early 1960s, network television started just slotting in old classic Hollywood films. This is one of the reasons that, one of the ways in which Citizen Kane elevates to become one of the greatest films of all time. Citizen Kane didn't really do well at the box office when it came out in 1942. It was, or 1941, sorry. It was a film that a lot of people knew was special and unusual and different by this boy wonderkind Orson Welles from Chicago, who had never made a movie before. But it was sort of largely forgotten. It was also wartime America. People moved on very quickly, et cetera, et cetera. But what brought Citizen Kane back was the fact that it started being shown late at night on television. People started tuning in. And this is one of the great... This is an excellent example, probably the supreme example of a movie that ages very well. I know a lot of people who watch Citizen Kane for the first time and they're like, "What's the big deal? I don't get what's so big about it." I usually tell them watch it 5 times and then come back and let's have a conversation.
Yeah, it's definitely you watch it a few times, and if it's thrown out as a movie to watch, I think you usually will watch it one more time at least. Yeah,
it's the great movies age like fine wines, and Citizen Kane is certainly that. So I suspect Wizard of Oz probably the 1960s or so, and it becomes embedded, as so many classic Hollywood movies become, in the more repetitious iterations of our culture through television. Shown on TV, shown on TV, shown on TV, and it becomes almost ritualistic and embedded in culture in a new way. Another example of this, of course, is It's a Wonderful Life, which was released in the summer, was never considered a Christmas movie, and through the kind of repetitions of television programming becomes the Christmas classic, right? The movie that everybody watches during Christmas. It's a Wonderful Life, directed by Frank Capra with Jimmy Stewart. Television creates, almost intertextually, creates new conversations with classic Hollywood cinema and American culture more broadly, and brings it back and filters it into this kind of almost formula or repetitious formula. Good stuff. And I never really thought of Wizard of Oz in terms of this international relations component. I think there's maybe even more to be said. Let's take it in a different direction here. Let's talk about Aristotle, the Greek philosopher Aristotle, in his response to Plato and Plato's Republic. Aristotle has a number of really key insights, metaphysical insights, the very nature of the human being, the nature of reality itself. And one of the key insights that I think fits directly into Wizard of Oz as a film text is the notion of living the purposeful life. This was key to Aristotle. Purpose is intimately bound up into the definition of things for Aristotle. The definition of things includes its telos, its purpose, right? So if you were to ask Aristotle, what is an oak tree? For Aristotle, his response would be the best one, right? What is an oak tree? The best one. What is Wizard of Oz as a film? It's the best one. Quality, the notion of quality and purpose is deeply interbound and embedded with the very definition of things. This is an unusual way of thinking. We usually don't think about the definition of things being inherently tethered to quality or purpose, right, or the final destination. But for Aristotle, it was. The best cat is the cat, or the definition of a cat was the best cat, and the best cat was one that fulfilled its purpose of hunting, for example, right? So our purposes go all the way deep down into the conception of the very definition of things and the very reality of things itself. Purpose and definition is themselves bound to the notion of quality. And what is quality, right? The question of what is quality, I think, is one of these timeless philosophical questions. How do we conceive of quality? How do we create perhaps potentially a formula or a system with which we can test and discern what quality is. What is the good? What is quality? This is the, of course, central question of one of my favorite books, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, by Robert Pirsig, in which, traveling across the country on a motorcycle, this question comes up again and again. What is quality? What is excellence? Right? How do we determine excellence? What says you, Dr. Dan? What determines excellence? What determines quality in the universe?
If it works.
If it works, right? And I think this goes centrally to Aristotle's insight about quality, and in fact, the central to the answer in Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. What quality is the efficiency of the ends being realized in a way. Does your motorcycle work? Is it functioning at its highest level?
Can it fulfill its purpose?
Can it fulfill its purpose? Quality is the fulfillment of purpose. I love that. Quality is, but let me challenge that a little bit, okay? If it works, right? There's this practical, almost mechanistic component to quality and excellence in this way. It must work. This is, I think, that every pragmatist in the world worth their salt would answer in this way. Does it work, right? And are the means functionally delivering a kind of experiential knowledge that we can understand the process, right? But what about art? Quality is this like elusive and essential concept in the human experience. Really hard to pin down. What is quality? And I think art is this very, very shaky and unstable ground on which quality is constantly tested and retested and violated and undermined and reasserted and providing new definitions, right? What constitutes good art, right? What constitutes quality in art? Is it still if it works? And how do we understand that?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of that's too is if it works, does it have purpose? And then perhaps does it connect?
Mm-hmm.
So if one does not connect to something, perhaps its quality is not up to par and it doesn't quite have the purpose it's supposed to have.
How does good art connect?
I think it connects with someone in an unspoken way.
Mm-hmm.
It connects with someone in a spoken way. I think it's very overdetermined. The way that someone can take a picture of a rock or turn around and take a picture of an image that's reflected in a little pool of water, and someone might find something interesting in that. The way that Bob Ross paints a picture in real time, the way that you would go see the Mona Lisa, the way that you could sit and listen to feedback for an hour and enjoy it and call it quality art. I think it's really about connection, and perhaps a degraded way of thinking about quality of art is the moment you begin to assign meaning and from the top down. So I think for the most part, it just depends on the audience and if it connects to an audience or either unintended or intended.
You said top down. What do you mean by that?
I would say sort of the taste makers, so the art critics, someone who has a hand on sort of the voices, the newscasters, or art critics, film critics, magazines. You always see a difference between. I think the Joker, right? The Joker just came out, and I keep seeing completely different takes. Yeah,
New York Times had a review, really terrible.
Yeah, and then Michael Moore turned around and said, "No, look, he's us." And so it's, I think people are seeing what they want to see in it, and I haven't seen it yet.
Yeah,
but,
I'm always interested in contested and very controversial works of art, which there are a lot of detractors, because it's often, if you look back in history, the artwork that stays with us, the artwork that resonates and ages well, is the artwork that had very little universal praise in its time. You think of the great movie Citizen Kane. It wasn't a big box office slam. Not a lot of people just ignored it. Hitchcock's Vertigo, now considered one of the great, if not the greatest film of all time, did actually quite poorly at the box office. And you think of Vincent van Gogh as an artist, or other artistic iterations that come up, there's always sort of the stuff that ages tends to be pretty controversial, or at least contested in terms of its interpretations at the time.
Yeah, which perhaps that's the purpose, is to create conversation, and if you can create that binary conversation, I think that keeps it alive and keeps it relevant for people. And
Yeah.
so perhaps the Joker, we already know it's good art because different voices from the top down are saying completely different things about it. So it is telling us about our social world of today, because people are obviously seeing the same movie, but they're seeing something different.
Yeah, from the same source, seeing different things. I've always thought that a good quality to art, or art of good quality, is art that unsettles in one way or another. There is something unsettling about it. There is something that actually does not sit right. There is not full and easy contentment. There are plenty of movies that I've seen that are fairly contentable and easy to watch, pleasurable viewing, but ones that I have very little interest in returning to. The films that I often have this sort of, this itch to return to, it is because there is something unsettling about it. There is something actually even that I don't like. I've often taught I teach Michelangelo Antonioni's Blow Up in a lot of my film classes, and I encourage students to hate the film, as I used to hate the film for years, because it's better to hate a film than it is to be bored by a film. And if you're hating a film, there's something there. It's doing something to you. It's making a connection, as you say.
The connection.
Right? And connections don't always have to be pleasurable or about contentment necessarily. Let me ask you another question, too. I mean, you talk about the critics, and it seems as though your conception of good quality art, there's a very important role that critics play. Critics are not always praised and celebrated. What about the author? What about the auteur? What's the author's role in the creation of art? Or maybe a more specific question, how much control does the author have over the work of art itself?
I think once the work is complete and it leaves that person's hands, it's out of their hands literally, so it becomes something else.
And they have very little control over it.
I would say so, because suddenly it's not theirs anymore. Even through property rights, it's theirs, but the meanings that come out of it depend on who it connects with and their reasons why they connect to it. And so, I mean, that's the best thing about art and music and film, and it's apparently random and chaotic. But I think when you read through the lines, you do see patterns of humanity. I think when you say, like, what does humanity look like? I say a really good glimpse of humanity are the various reactions to art and film and music. When people see one thing and they come up with completely different takes, that space between those two takes, somewhere in there, I wouldn't say is an objective view, but you can find out what that thing is doing by looking at these two arguments about the same thing that are seeing something completely different.
There's an interpretation here of art and interpretation that the auteur is really just the first interpreter to come along. Nietzsche, in fact, has written quite eloquently about the role, the relationship between the art and the artist, in both Birth of Tragedy and Beyond Good and Evil. And from the Nietzschean perspective, art is really like this monster in the forest that can never be fully controlled by the artist. And the artist is really just kind of an explorer who can witness like certain facets of art. Like art is really a force outside of human control entirely. And we have very little will or directorship, if you will, to manifest and create the art. The art is really this force in the universe that sometimes we can see and sometimes we can't. Yeah,
I think of it as a good artist can channel. A good artist can channel something that's already out there, but put it into such a package that then resonates positively or negatively, however you want to describe it, with other human beings. And that's, I think, that out of control moment, right? It can go either way.
Let me offer a kind of workable definition of art. An artifact, a medium, or an iteration that challenges the very definition of art. In other words, art is a war over its own boundaries. Art is kind of a conflict over the boundaries of what constitutes art. The moment we start to create certain guidelines about what constitutes art and what does not constitute art, the avant-garde, especially the front lines, are going to come along and smash those boundaries and tear down those fences and those guidelines. What do you think, Dr. Dan?
I think it's a good definition, because art then becomes humanity.
Mm-hmm.
Humanity, as much as we like to revere the past, we enjoy destroying the past. But you could also have art as comforting. You know, I think of when you go to stores and you see all these posters and sort of mundane, you know, paintings that you can buy and put inside your house. It's not like it's not art, but it's just mass produced and it's comforting.
Mm-hmm.
But then there is, you know, like Lou Reed metal machine art, right? So can you sit through 4 sides of Lou Reed doing feedback?
Yeah.
And
yes,
come out the other side and say, oh, that was amazing.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think there's broad spectrums of art. And again, it's a reflection of sort of humanity. So
yeah, well done with the Lou Reed reference. My daughter's middle name is Lou for a reason. So very nice. Well, you know, going back to what we're talking about with Aristotle, the purposeful life, right? That the definition of a thing includes its purpose. I think this is a really interesting way of understanding Dorothy and understanding our relationship to Dorothy in this film, that we basically are Dorothy. Dorothy is filled to the brim with purpose. There is this kind of energetic purposefulness that exists throughout this film. And it's not just Dorothy. Indeed, every identity fragment from within us, from the Scarecrow, the Tin Man, the Lion, there's a well-defined and intense sense of purpose. To know, for the Scarecrow, knowledge, right? To love, the emotive connection, the emotional basis of understanding what it means to be a human, the Tin Man. And the desire to conquer fear, the role of courage, the spirited part of our soul, according to Plato. That is, we all have these drives, and they're all part of a kind of purposeful journey of finding meaning in our life. These are all forms of the good, and thus definitions of quality to a certain degree. And this leads us to Aristotle's, essentially his answer about what quality is and about purpose, which is that matter is utilized to manifest form, which is the blueprint. Matter is the sort of the real material, the matter of our universe, the soil, the trees, the natural world, our biological and physical bodies, the matter of the universe. We use this matter to create blueprints, to create forms, to create sketches and ideas, right? All of the materials for a house disassembled and put into a giant pile is not a house. It requires form, right? Not just matter. We need blueprints. We need ideas. This, indeed, the realm of forms is the ideational realm, according to Plato, where reality really resides. Aristotle doesn't necessarily agree with that and wants a more grounded experiential sense of the universe, thus a role for matter, a role for action, which is the next step, right? So matter is first. We take matter and we have blueprints and ideas to things, and then is the realm of action. That is the realm of efficient. And I've always thought that efficiency is a very clear-cut and straightforward answer to what is the notion of quality. Quality is efficiency, the shortest path from point A to point B, right? Efficiency is this, in some ways, underappreciated aspect that filters into almost every little corner of the human experience. I always tell my students, be efficient writers. Being an efficient writer is being an effective writer. Efficiency is necessary in the sciences, in engineering, in the social sciences, and all the work that we do in thinking efficiently. And for Aristotle, efficiency is the realm of action, right? When things are actually done. All of these things combined together, you reach a final destination, and that's telos. That is purpose itself, right? So if we think about this through Wizard of Oz and through the characters, Think of the matter of the scarecrow, of straw, of cloth, the rudimentary binding together of his self without any real connective tissue other than, some, hay, some cloth, some string. There's no connective thought, or so he claims, at least. Think of the matter of the Tin Man, the metals that compose him all the way down, an absolute composition in metal, so as to highlight his lack of heart, his lack of soul, his lack of love, all these sorties of emotions. Think of the lion, too, who is an animal of nature, of pure and direct matter, biological, claws and all, right? So now think of the form in each of these figures. Knowledge in the scarecrow, his fumbling, circus-like helicopter intrigues and absorbing all there is to know, right? Think of love as the blueprint in the Tin Man, the torrent of the heart, that the heart which draws up the face like a string into the Tin Man's smile, which is almost always compelled to dance, that great dance the Tin Man does. I think the best dance of the movie. And courage in the lion, courage being the manifestation of spirit itself. These are ancient archetypical identities that correspond to Plato's tripart conception of the human soul. Plato conceived of justice as something that was both internal and external. And I always like to think about that in relation to our conception of justice today, because we often don't think of justice as something that's internal in our souls. We always think of justice as sort of like out there in the world. But for Plato, justice was inside. And there were three parts of our soul. There's the reasoned part of our soul, which is where our rational thought comes from. There are the appetites of our soul, which is our desires, right? And then there is the spirit of our soul, which is where courage and morality and religiosity comes from. And so justice is when reason cultivates moderation in the appetites, and it cultivates courage in the spirit. And I see this within, in some ways, the characters of The Wizard of Oz, that the scarecrow is this sort of reasoned part of our soul, and the lion is the spirited part of our soul where courage resides, and the appetites where desire and where love and emotion ultimately reside is the realm of the Tin Man.
I think, too, going back to that, the quality, efficiency, if you bring this all together, again, if 1900 the book comes out, 1939, the film. This is also about the disorganization of society through mass production, through the immigrant experience coming in, inability to speak the language, know the culture. And so what you're talking about, too, is the existential crisis of the early 20th century American experience, and then you're setting it in the heartland. So it's
and it's dissembling and breaking down, and we're going into this sort of kaleidoscope of confusion out into the land of Oz. Yeah. But it's a journey within us as well as a journey outside the borders.
Perhaps people see, in terms of that connection, if we're all Dorothy, we connect differently to the other characters depending on what we feel we lack.
Now let's think of efficiency. We looked at the matter of each of these. We looked at the form and the blueprint of each of these. Now think of efficiency. For Aristotle, efficiency is that very action that manifests the good, as I mentioned before. It is the means in themselves. Consider the scarecrow, Tin Man, and lion in this regard. Each has a very specific and meaningful form of movement. The scarecrow, with his frenetic windmill action, as I mentioned before, having freed himself from the post in a field. The Tin Man, the slow and conscious workings of his limbs after being properly oiled, right? Culminating in his delightful emotive dance. The lion and all his bounding and jumping up and down. The supposed courage, his tail swaying, right? Almost like Tigger and Winnie the Pooh, right? Bounding around.
Yes.
But the efficiency of action cuts deeper in this film. It is the yellow brick road itself, the pathway, the journey of enacting that which manifests quality, purpose, and good in each character. Each character, of course, being a part of us. We're going on the journey. We're going inside of us as we're looking out onto the movie screen. And the final form, the telos, being the destination, of course. And I think the destination is not really the city of Oz. But it's that black bag that's held by Oz. That what's inside that black bag, right? The badge of courage for the lion, right? The heart that Oz pulls out of the black bag, the diploma for the scarecrow, right? And this is that moment in which Dorothy stops and says, "I don't think there's anything in that black bag for me," right? But the black bag is sort of the telos and destination. It only affirms, though, that which is already inside of us, right? All of those little props in the black bag are just merely like mirrors and reflective surfaces to remind us that Scarecrow already had the knowledge, right? You utilize this knowledge on your journey, the means toward the ends. The Tin Man already had that emotive capacity of love. He's already shared it several times. And the lion was already courageous, right? These props only help us see that which is already inside of us. Interesting side note here, I just, was thinking about this recently, that the purposes of the witches, and also the purpose of Oz as well, but the witches themselves, east, west, and north, they're entirely unclear in this film. No one knows what their motivations are and what they're really doing. You get the sense of like this really deep political existential struggle. I've always interpreted Oz as a convenient, as his motivations are conveniently to do away with some of his competitors and enemies. But their purposes are really vague and not easily defined.
Yeah, I never really thought about that.
Let's think about another couple of elements from Aristotle that I want to bring out. So we were talking about the purposeful life and matter, form, efficient, and final. There's also in Aristotle the value of experiential knowledge and experiential life. Knowledge in life is something we must experience for Aristotle. And this, I think, is a really important critique or revision of Platonic idealism, where Plato, reality is the realm of forms. No chair on earth, no earthly manifestation of a chair is nearly as perfect as the form of chairs in the realm of forms. And that the ideational realm is really where reality resides. And this is something that I have been talking about in this podcast quite a bit. It's sort of central to my understanding of the film, that if human consciousness is more real than the physical universe, indeed, if human consciousness created the physical universe, then movies are more real than the matter, hard and fact matter of the physical universe. This is very much a Platonic kind of conception. Well, we're bringing in Plato to challenge us a little bit and to bring us a little bit further on. And one of the things that Plato really grounds us in is the role of experiential knowledge and experiencing life. Our grounded day-to-day experience of things, or as David Foster Wallace describes, the everyday trenches of adult life, right? That must be lived and must be experienced, and we have some choice over what to think about in these everyday trenches of adult life. I think in this way, Dorothy is sort of literally awakening into adulthood. She is gathering the knowledge necessary to find the purposeful and meaningful life. On that journey, the experience matters. And this, I think, leads us to a distinction in Aristotle between scientific intelligence and practical intelligence. Scientific intelligence understands nature and provides a universal, precise, and unvarying account of our natural world, something like gravity or the speed of light, right? Scientific intelligence looks at sort of absolutes or seeming absolutes and tests them and looks for the repetition of the same outcomes again and again and again. Deductive reasoning is itself, I think, an important aspect of scientific intelligence. Deductive reasoning, the process of reasoning from one or more premises, universal premises, to reach a logically certain conclusion, right? This is as opposed to inductive reasoning, which is reasoning in which the premises are viewed as probable but not certain, right? Scientific intelligence is much more wedded to a Platonic conception or a Platonic philosophy, that there is only one conception of justice, and it's the same one inside of Dr. Dan as it is inside Dr. J. It's the same one inside you, the listener. It is the same one external in the just city as well. There's one conception of justice. There is one ideal form of the chair, right? The realm of forms is absolute and somewhat scientific in this way. Practical intelligence, brought out by Aristotle, is quite different. Practical intelligence understands actions and the realm of experience that are good. It seeks to understand human society. In practical intelligence, there is not the constancy or exactitude among factors when one studies something like, for example, the human experience, right? We are composed of particles and atoms, but we do not act like particles and atoms. There is contingency and randomness and things like art and things like the subjective nature of the human experience, right? Especially in the realm of ethics and in politics, practical intelligence is very important, much more so than scientific intelligence. What it means to be a good statesman really does depend, for Aristotle, on the type of government and the type of people to be ruled. What it means to be a good person is predicated on practical, not scientific intelligence. Theories can sometimes prove useless in explaining or predicting occurrences in our world, as they use the process of deductive reasoning to provide a general theory that tries to simplify the world. This is, of course, useful in the hard sciences, in the lab, in our research experiments, but it should be used very cautiously in the social sciences, and understanding history and how it moves forward, and understanding politics, right, and what justice is in these conceptions of politics. So the only way to understand a human being, according to Aristotle, is to understand them in relation to others. Our social relations are absolutely crucial. We cannot understand Dr. Dan in isolation. We must understand Dr. Dan and the connective tissues that he has with other human beings in his social fabric. That's when we understand human beings more fully and more deeply. Politics, indeed, for Aristotle, is about our relations to others. Politics is about the art of identifying social and public problems and finding solutions to those problems. And if you think about it, Dorothy's relationships in The Wizard of Oz are a prism through which we understand ourselves, or the prism through which Dorothy understands herself, right? Relations between Dorothy and those that she comes across is really, that's the foundation of the story in Wizard of Oz. It's about her relationship to other people. For Aristotle, social relations are an essential starting point for understanding human beings, as I mentioned. If we strive to understand a particular human being in isolation, let's say we observe Dr. Dan in isolation and no communication with other human beings for about 5 days, we would have a much more impoverished viewpoint of Dr. Dan, left with isolated and contingent facts. But if we observed him with only 48 hours as opposed to 5 days, and 48 hours associating with other human beings, talking with one another, other human beings, being in dialogue and communication, I think we have a much fuller and robust understanding of who Dr. Dan is. Does that sound about right, Dr. Dan?
Yeah, I think it's, again, goes back to the art, the ability to connect. And I think, just an hour ago I was lecturing on fascism, and one of the critical points of thinking about fascism is the aesthetic, right? The artistic aesthetic of fascism, and the way it connected with enough people to make it become this, this durable threat in the 20s and 30s up through today. It's can't underestimate the role of that connection. Right.
Yeah, it's the social relations, and what brings about the manifestation of a human for Aristotle. It brings about our purpose and our meaning. The definition of which is the best is the good and quality. And who really is Dorothy, after all? Who is Dorothy? For Aristotle, we cannot even begin to understand her without understanding her relation to others. Her relations with Hunk, Hickory, Zeke, and their doppelgangers, of course, Scarecrow and Tin Man and the Lion, right? Hunk and Hickory and Zeke are the farmhands back in Kansas, who are, of course, played by the same actors as the Scarecrow, the Tin Man, and the Cowardly Lion. Even Toto provides the basis of relations through which we empathize with Dorothy, and we see ourselves within Dorothy. And this relational nature of human beings, it cuts against a liberal view. A liberal view of humanity, which is that we're isolated and atomistic nodes of will and purpose and experience and achievement, and the only thing that matters is sort of that individualistic perspective. That's where meaning of life is created in this deeper ontological sense of what the liberal view is, right? This relational nature is much more communitarian. It asserts that we can only understand human beings in that social fabric, and that we are thickly situated within that social fabric, radically situated. And the social sphere is what really ultimately defines us. We are hopeless in understanding really what human beings are if we look at them just in isolation, in these little isolated atoms.
Yeah, no, it's perfect because, again, if you look at the politics, the teens, 20s, 30s, you do have that classical liberal sense of politics embedded. The 20s perhaps is that heyday.
Rugged individualism of Herbert
and
Hoover.
The
Yep.
Depression hits, and suddenly, whether you go fascist or you go welfare state or even communist, right, there's a renewed sense towards community, whether it takes the form of fascism, communism, or the welfare state. So that's interesting. It does go against the classical liberal, rugged individualist.
Another point here from Aristotle, the sensible values of the golden mean. It is often joked that Aristotle died of excessive moderation, that Aristotle's moral compass and point of view is about the golden mean, which is that, and he takes this from a kind of dichotomous sense of the development of human knowledge, which is that where there is a debate and contestation over something, it usually is an indication that there's some bit of truth on each side. In fact, Aristotle would assert that the more contentious an issue is, the more likely it is that truth is sort of shared and mixed between the two. And the process of kind of dialectic synthesis is to figure out what the truthful strands are of these two different sides. And indeed, for Aristotle, the truth is usually somewhere in the middle, right? Somewhere in the middle. And that's really sort of this conception of the golden mean. Well, Dorothy exhibits this throughout the film. She's always moderate and measured. She always seeks the temperate path. Her purpose is intensely felt, to be free from home or to return home. But the means for Dorothy are judicious, are ecumenical, are empathic.
Very heartland.
Yes, indeed, very heartland. She brings the heartland to the land of Oz, and in this way is very successful in negotiating the power struggles that be. This connects to another point that I want to make from Aristotle, and in politics, Aristotle asserts very clearly that women should be excluded from politics. Women are confined to the private sphere. They're not capable of the kind of virtue that is civic virtue of living a public and social life. Dorothy, I think, shows this kind of pent-up frustration from this archaic and unjust and indeed barbaric conception that women are not worthy of living a political life. Here's a young woman who kills a tyrant, marshals a force of mercenaries, confers with political leaders, destroys an even more powerful force of evil, and aids the path to power for her allies, right? This is a remarkable success story in terms of politics and in terms of conflict and warfare. This is a woman who defies all the odds of that archaic Aristotelian conception of women excluded from politics. And finally, lastly, the virtue of friendship. So very important to Aristotle, the virtue of friendship. Friendship, in fact, is the path toward happiness for Aristotle. And it is that crucial relationship that must be cultivated. Friendship is virtuous. And virtuous relationships that extend in the private and in the public sphere are the path and purpose toward the ultimate telos, I think, for Aristotle. One might argue that the ultimate telos for human beings is to live a political life, and that certainly makes sense. But I think there's a deeper one as well, which is the telos of happiness. And happiness, as anyone who has experienced the day-to-day trenches of adult life knows, happiness is very elusive. Happiness is actually really, really hard. On the surface of things, it seems to be easy, just happy-go-lucky Mickey Rooney MGM movie from the 1930s. But happiness is difficult, right? When you define what makes you happy, sure enough, wait around a little bit, and you will find it's merely an illusion of an oasis in a desert.
A lack of connection.
A lack of connection. Is that what you see as the antithesis of happiness?
Yeah, I would say without connections, people begin to lose a frame of reference. Mm-hmm. And sometimes that frame of reference can go in negative sorts of ways. So I think connectivity is that. I think it's literally becomes that, that phrase, being connected. If you're not connected, you're disconnected, which sometimes goes to dark places. The
mhm.
Joker, for instance.
Yeah.
I think that movie is just all about, at least what I read, is someone becoming disconnected, wanting to connect, unable to connect, and then you become the Joker.
Maybe we should fit the Joker into one of these episodes after we see it.
Yes.
Yeah, I think Aristotle would agree with you. Certainly, the virtue of friendship is that a shared life is absolutely crucial. Without a shared life, virtue is impossible, right? And without friends, there can be no shared life that can manifest things like virtue and meaning and purpose. Connection is absolutely crucial. I want to leave you all in this podcast with the story of my daughter, Giovanna, who The Wizard of Oz was her first movie obsession. She was literally just 2 years old, and she would sit down and very quietly and intensely watch this movie from beginning to end. She was obsessed, and I mean obsession. She must have watched it at least a dozen times in a 12-month period of time, almost always from beginning to end, watching intently, for the most part, every single scene. I once put in The Never-Ending Story, and she started crying. I once put in Milo and Otis. A week later, she started crying again, confused as to why I would play anything other than The Wizard of Oz. Her favorite sequences are when Dorothy falls into the pig pen, only to be saved by Zeke, right? The up inside the cyclone scene. But particularly, the moment when Dorothy opens the door to Munchkinland, inaugurating the color sequences of the film. She sort of grins in warm satisfaction when seeing the color. She also loves the Cowardly Lion sequences, especially his song, "If I Were a King of the Forest." She's definitely the Cowardly Lion, Giovanna. Courage is sort of the node from which she understands her lived experience. Courage, so crucial. She has a bundle of it, but she also is quick to fright, right? She shares that kind of fear, desire, that kind of feeling of not having it, but actually it's there, right, and manifested deep within her. I am, of course, as her father, inevitably the Scarecrow, with the same kind of bundles and tensions with regards to knowledge. Always desperately wanting to know. Probably the reason why I got a PhD and became a professor, because I wanted to know, and I always felt like I didn't know enough. Lori Donna, my wife, is the Tin Man, plumbing the depths of her heart. And we are all, again, Dorothy, just to return to the central concept. We are all Dorothy, trying to return home, the search for our native sense of being at home in the physical and earthly realm. The Wicked Witch is our wicked nature, in which possessiveness, like the apple tree sequence, anger, the uses of fire, euphoric gratification becoming addiction, the poppies that put them to sleep, terror, surrender Dorothy in the sky, cruelty, the flying monkey attack, and the paralyzing fear of death, the hourglass scene that will kill Dorothy, right? All tend to overwhelm our better natures. Glinda, the Witch of the North, is our ideal abstraction of righteousness, beauty, and virtue. The Wizard is obviously our internal conditioning of authority, to whom we appeal for the realization of our virtues, the very things we feel we lack and we desperately seek. But we all know, folks, that in the earthly realm, the Wizard is really only Professor Marvel, and that external authority is the emperor without any clothes, that the mastery of virtue comes from within. This is Dr. J's Movie Imaginarium. We're here with Dr. Dan. I think we did well today, Dr. Dan, did we?
Yes,
All
very
right.
fun.
All right. Until next time, folks, watch your movies and make sure to keep in mind those movies are reality. Thank you all very much, and have a great day.